In this video, we analyse where to bring your frontline tanks, how and when to apply pressure to enemy vehicles, and using the minimap to effectively attack and defend the capture circle. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to the first of hopefully many of these new style replay analysis videos that I'm going to be trialing on this channel. I'm trying to search for the better format for presenting the way that the players really do well to you guys, and this is sort of the latest iteration. The star of this video is called So a wise man once said that if you can't pronounce the player's name or if you don't know it, then simply call them Dave, so that's what I'll be doing. Dave is playing the T-150, the Tier 6 Russian heavy tank, and they are on Himmelsdorf on an encounter battle. Now let's take a look at where they're going for their initial position. I think it's important to draw attention to the initial position Dave takes especially, as well as other positions that are taken by the enemies and friendlies in this game. And I'm going to break it down into two major parts. The first being sort of the micro aspect of it, the exact positioning that Dave elects to take and the cover they use, etc, etc. And the other one will be the sort of larger aspect of it, where they've decided to go on the map, how many allies are with them, what they're up against, that kind of thing. So let's first talk about the micro aspect, the exact positioning that Dave has used in their initial position. They haven't picked an innovative spot. You'll almost certainly find a tank or two working this corner on any Himmelsdorf match in any mode. But I wanted to draw attention to it because of the importance, I think, of the environment and protecting your tank. Even if it's just a small rock, a piece of rubble, a building, an outcropping, that kind of thing, even destructible terrain when considering premium ammunition like heat, the environment around you essentially has infinite armor. There is no way an enemy tank can penetrate yours through a piece of environment. It has to be directly hitting your tank. To that end, if you know where your weak points are, or at least have a general idea of where they are in terms of your frontline tanks, where you're going to be bringing them, you can use the environment to hide those weak spots and essentially give them infinite armor. And on top of it being a RNG based accuracy mechanic for every gun in the game, you increase the chance that they're just going to flub the shot into the rubble and do no damage, giving you the advantage in the combat. So how has Dave put this strategy into effect? Well, if you look from the perspective of where the enemies will be coming from, you can see that Dave's tank is mostly hidden aside from the very strongly armoured front of the turret and the very well angled turret cheeks, and just slightly the commander's hatch, which is considered a weak point on the T-150. Obviously, the lower plate of Dave's tank is also completely hidden, so that guarantees that it won't be penetrated. So Dave has significantly increased the resilience of their tank just by positioning. I also want to draw attention to the orientation of Dave's tank. They have elected to point the front of it outwards towards the road, so they are on the corner. The other option here would be to sort of angle it and side scrape out onto the corner, but I'm going to try and explain why, at the start of the game at least, that isn't the best idea. There are 15 enemy tanks at the start of the battle, and you have no idea which way any of them are going to go. It's unlikely, but 10 could come up against you, or 2. So the point being, you need to preserve your hit points in case you expose yourself to half of the enemy team right at the start of the game, because chances are 8 tanks shooting at you are going to do a lot more damage than 1 or 2. Dave achieves this in their initial position by pointing their tank such that if they reverse, they can very, very quickly keep their tank out of harm's way. They're right next to a building, and the rubble is also protecting, of course, the lower plate and most of the hull, and reversing will completely obscure Dave's tank from any amount of enemy fire. If you were to imagine Dave's tank was angled in sort of the opposite direction, as it were, so slightly angled out, allowing them to side scrape out behind that rubble, it would put them at risk because it would take more time for them to back out and turn in going forwards, and that would increase the angle on their side armour, potentially letting more shots through. The T150 is an exceptionally well armoured machine, but if, for example, you're playing a heavy tank with good frontal armour but not so good side armour, something like, I don't know, the T57 Heavy, you are putting yourself at risk of just taking unnecessary fire, and that's really not what you want at the start of the game, because it could very well be 3 or 4 shots coming in at quick succession. Now let's talk about the initial position that Dave takes with respect to the map, the more strategic aspect of it. Dave has elected to go for the very popular spot on what's commonly known as Banana Street on Himmelsdorf. And as they get into position, I'm going to talk firstly about why this position is quite good, and then about who comes with Dave and who they'll be up against in the early game. The main reason why this position is so good on Himmelsdorf that Dave has taken is because of the lack of firing angles that the enemy has. In fact, there's only really one direction, at the start of the game at least, that the enemies can engage Dave from, and that's the front, where the enemies will pile up in sort of the opposite position from their deployment. There is no shots from the eastern side of the map up on the castle. No tank has the gun depression to loop a shot down. Dave can't be shot from the western side of the map because friendlies are heading up there, and it is, on top of that, is an encounter battle. And they can't be shot from across the courtyard in the centre of the map because there are buildings in the way. Now, I appreciate it's quite an obvious observation I've just made, but I think it sheds light on a very important point about map knowledge. There are benefits to map knowledge in the game, especially with getting back to base quicker and finding good positions, but a key one that sometimes gets overlooked is knowing who can back you up in terms of firing lanes and firing angles, and what kind of shots you can actually take and what kind of runs you can take. And thankfully this situation is quite obvious. It's fairly clear as to who can back Dave up in this context, but you need to think about in your games, when you're on a more open map, you need to think about where sort of the hills and undulations are, and it might look like a friendly tank will be able to back you up. They might have line of sight on the enemies attacking you, judging from the mini-map, but in reality there's a hill in the way and you're on your own. So to that end then, let's take a look at how the friendly team has deployed around Dave. And you can see that Dave has only got a small amount of backup in terms of the P43 BIS. Now, this is a top tier medium tank in this game, so it is quite a significant machine, and paired with the T150 can really get some work done. But apart from that, there's no real backup. As I said, the friendlies on the eastern side of the map up to the castle have no shots at all, and there aren't really any friendlies in the west to take advantage of crossfire that might appear if the enemy advanced down Banana Street. A mistake that a lot of people, including myself, are susceptible to making is when they're in their top tier brawlers of tanks and they see that there is no enemies in front of them, especially when they do have backup in terms of a top tier medium tank with them, they decide to push forward and apply pressure to they don't know how many enemies. And this relates back to my point about the enemies not being spotted yet. You don't know how many you're coming up against, so you could well run into 4 or 5 enemy tanks, and as you're moving, your accuracy is decreased, you are probably out in the open in order to actually get forwards, and all this adds up into you potentially walking into an ambush that could be very detrimental for your tank. And I think this kind of mistake is one to pick up on because it just ruins the fun of the game. You're walking headfirst into a trap, you lose half or more of your hit points, and you just feel like you're going to lose from the get-go. So to prevent this from happening in the first place, I would just suggest holding back for a minute or so and just gaining more information about the battlefield. Their enemies will have to come to you because chances are if you force yourself to wait a minute, they'll be in the same situation. If you can't see them, they can't see you. They'll be itching for a target just like you will, and if you let them make the first move, chances are you'll have a very easy initial shot, giving you the advantage in the combat. But other than that, let's have a quick look at how the whole team has deployed. And it's fairly balanced. Most of the team has actually gone up to the castle area in the eastern side of the map to go for a big fight. This usually happens no matter what the game mode is on Himmelsdorf. This seems to be quite a magnetic spot for most of the team. But the team has sent a significant amount of tanks down to the cap circle. So what this means is, in the grand scheme of things, if the enemy has almost fully committed to the castle fight in the east, it will be very easy for the KV-1, especially the T-67 and the Stug, to just put pressure on the cap circle, and as the enemy rush back down to try and defend it, Dave and possibly the P-43 BIS will be able to just catch them unawares and put some really big shots into them and give the capturers a lot of information about what's coming to try and get the reset. Right, with all that said and done, let's get back to the fight in hand. And as it happens, a enemy Panzer IV-H comes straight down the road, and good knowledge there from Dave that they can just go straight through the truck in the middle of the road, straight into the turret of the Panzer IV, which isn't that strong. And you can see the Panzer IV is already flubbing shells into the rubble in front. I don't think they're going to get much done against the frontal armour of the T-150 with that 105mm. I'm pretty sure they're firing high explosive, it's just bouncing off. But an enemy T1 Heavy turns up as well. There you go, 33 hit points only from the Panzer IV-H, barely a scratch, but at least it's some chip damage. The accuracy of the T-150 letting Dave down there. They got 2 through the gun mantlet essentially of the Panzer IV, and now the T1 Heavy is having a go at them. It's in this engagement where Dave, I think, makes a minor mistake, but it could be argued that it's not really one. You can see Dave is still reloading, but is sat out in the open. They can't fire, they're just waiting for their aiming circle as well as their shell to load. And what this allows the T1 Heavy to do is get a pair of return shots off into Dave's commander's hatch. It's the only place that that tank can actually penetrate, and the T1 Heavy is not firing premium, so they get both shots in. So it cost Dave about 250 health to just sit there and finish off that Panzer IV-H, and considering how well the Panzer IV-H was doing, not really a great trade from them, but they do something very, very good here in applying pressure to this T1 Heavy. This camera angle, I think, does a good job of illustrating how to effectively apply pressure to your enemy once you've figured out the engagement. Now, 2 minutes ago I was just talking about how you shouldn't push up by any means necessary because you could walk straight into a trap. This is true at the start of the battle, but what's changed as more time has elapsed is around the map more and more enemies have been spotted, and what this means is you can rule them out as surprise enemies that turn up in the heat of the moment when you're trying to finish off said T1 Heavy. As Dave feels more and more confident that they won't be interrupted with the engagement and all of the combatants are present, they rightly decide to apply pressure and win the fight as quickly as possible. So let's see how they accomplish this and secure the victory. So, as I said before, all of the combatants are now accounted for. There is no foreseeable sort of backup for the T1 Heavy. So what we see here is a tier 5 holding up 2 top tier tanks on the friendly team, and if you look at it in that context, that's very, very good work by the T1 Heavy. They are stopping 2 very powerful tanks from advancing forward. So what Dave has done is advanced up from their initial position, which was well protected and did have shots on the T1 Heavy when it poked out, and advanced up to the sort of midpoint of the street from this perspective. This does a lot more than simply get Dave's gun closer to the enemy, so it mitigates the T150's poor accuracy. It also closes down the angles that the T1 Heavy can actually use. If Dave had stayed in their initial position along with the P-43 BIS, Dave could only take shots at the T1 Heavy when it poked out. So what this means is the T1 Heavy had the option to fall back. Now, what it did when it fell back is completely up in the air because we don't know. It could have fallen back all the way to the end of the street. It could have just made it to a corner, but it would have relieved the pressure of the engagement on the T1 Heavy, and that's what it was after, because 95 to 99% of the time, that T1 Heavy is going to lose the engagement if it stays there. It's a tier 5 Heavy up against 2 tier 6s. So what Dave's secondary position has done here is removed that option from the T1 Heavy's playbook and made the odds of the T1 Heavy's winning even worse, because also Dave has intelligently used the rubble further up the street to mask some of their weak points, especially the lower plate, and maintain that strong turret profile that they're able to be doing throughout the entire game. So in short, what this maneuver has done is maintain the unfairness of the engagement. It was 2 tier 5s against 2 tier 6s. The 2 tier 6s should win. But if Dave had let that T1 heavy get away, then it could have potentially turned into 2 tier 6s against who knows how many enemies, who with the advantage of maybe a crossfire or long range fire support. And for example here, this enemy KV-1, if the T1 heavy had fallen back, Dave realised they didn't have any shots, they just ran straight up the middle of the road. The KV-1 potentially would have had side shots, and then if the T1 heavy was thinking on their feet, they could have had a crossfire as a result. So Dave eliminated that possibility by moving up as early as they did, stopping the T1 heavy from opening up the angles. So here's the raw gameplay perspective of what I've just talked about from when Dave gets into their secondary position. You can see they're just searching for shots on the T1 heavy's turret really. The T1 heavy actually manages to get a shot through on the commander's hatch, and Dave is just trying to close down the angle. You can see they've got vision all the way down the end of the street. T1 heavy manages another shot into the commander's hatch of the T150. Dave is on the reload again. The T1 heavy finds another one and is trying to use that Panzer IV H-Ray, but you see the T1 heavy is a bit too tall for that. The enemy KV-1 appears, and it was actually a Stug that was providing the long range fire support down for the enemy on that, so not really too much of a threat for the T150. And you can see on the minimap that the friendly Fury has decided to join them as well. So Dave has pretty successfully taken on this flank and has broken it, getting 2 kills in the process. So as we saw from the previous perspective, this KV-1 will not last long. So let's take a quick look at the minimap and how the game is evolving. You can see the engagement in the east is still going on as expected. Most of the enemy tanks went there, as did most of the friendlies. So that's still grinding away. You can see that the enemy has put pressure on the cap circle. They haven't got it, they aren't currently capturing it, but they have tanks much closer and potentially outmatch the friendlies there. But back to Dave's perspective, and you can see that they are trying to finish off this Stug that was hassling them earlier. And the problem with the Russian heavies, pretty much all of them, is they are really, really good in a straight line. They aren't that good at turning, but they just don't have the engine power to go up in a straight line. On level ground they're fine, downhill they're really, really good, but they just don't have that brunt to accelerate fast enough, and you can see they really lose a lot of speed when going uphill. And as we see now, the enemy has begun to capture the encounter capture circle. And Dave's team is also 3 tanks down. Not too much of a disparity in total hit points, but in terms of the number of guns on each team, there is a significant disparity, and unfortunately Dave was unable to find that Stug. But Dave does make the correct decision here. They don't continue up the hill to reignite the castle fight as the couple of friendlies are doing. They instead go to defend their base. And this is the correct thing to do, because if Dave is stuck up on the castle, they can't do anything about the capture circle. But if they win the castle fight, they can put pressure on the cap and force the enemy towards them. Dave does find the enemy Staghound. I think they tried to get a explosive shell through there, or just rolled catastrophically low against the enemy Staghound. It looks like the latter was true, but the T150 is doing what it does best. It's just driving at the enemy, and Dave does catch quite a lucky shot there. But you can see now that the enemy is almost a third of the way, getting up for halfway, capturing the encounter circle. Dave will have plenty of time, but let's talk about attacking the base. There are a few aspects to consider when attacking the base on any game mode, even if it's standard, encounter or assault. The first one you need to consider is how much time you have. If you have plenty of time, there are more options you can use, like more avenues you can take, and different ways you can go about and try and get the jump on the tanks that you know are in the base. Now the second thing you need to observe is where the enemies are positioned on the map, and potentially where they were last spotted if they haven't been spotted for a while. You can see that from my previous point, Dave had a lot of time to capture the base, but you can see on the minimap, if they were to sort of drive down that road parallel to the cap circle, they would probably get lit up by the Cromwell Berlin and the M6 that was loitering around there as well. So Dave elects to just dive straight in and burn more hit points, making the crossing. So what has Dave taken advantage of here in terms of this late game situation? In terms of the amount of time left on the cap, there was something like 2 minutes left before Dave got into the circle, so there's definitely enough time for a T150 to travel 200 or 300 or so meters, potentially enough time to go around and deal with the Cromwell B. And even if the Cromwell B just drove into the cap circle and hid where the 5916 was, there would still be enough time for the T150, because we're looking at about 45 seconds to a minute before the base was captured, even with 2 of them in there. The true value of Dave's play and going into the cap circle early is that they tie up the Cromwell Berlin and the 5916 and potentially the M6. And at the start of the game there are 15 enemies, but now in this endgame situation there are 5 enemies. So in this move, Dave has successfully tied up 2, potentially 3, so 60% of the enemy's remaining tanks, and contested the cap circle, relieving the time pressure on the rest of their team, who are in favourable positions but not ones that are actionable in defending the base. So Dave has spent a few hit points to tie up a majority of the remainder of the enemy team and secure the cap circle essentially. So returning then to Dave's perspective, as they just pick up the Cromwell Berlin, and the T150 is really showing what it's good at here, stopping the enemy from really getting away and using their superior mobility to get at it. Now the M10 RFBM shows up and puts a shot into Dave's tank, and the M10 just decides to sit there and try and get some extra shots in, try and finish Dave off, which allows Dave to aim in and get the return shot, and the very large gun on the T150 helps them out there. The 5916, potentially sensing the chance after Dave had fired, goes for the Matilda, an easy kill for the tier 6 light, and manages to finish it off. And you can see that the T150 is not great at turning, and this soft ground is slowing it down. So the Matilda unfortunately dies, but Dave is able to turn around and shoot the distracted 5916 in the back. So now all that's left in the game is the enemy M6. Dave has turned this game around. Now that friendlies are threatening the cap, Dave has support, and the M6 is on the other side of the map, so Dave has plenty of opportunity to try and close out this game. So now we transition to the sort of final stages of this game. Dave is now sat on the base, the friendly Fury is fighting but unfortunately loses to the M6, and you can see the M6 actually shows the back of the turret to Dave's T150, and unfortunately, as I mentioned before, every tiny piece of rock rubble has infinite armor, and in that case saves the M6 from a premium round from the T150's gun just by a whisker. So if that doesn't drill home the importance of using terrain, then I don't know what will. But now we transition to defending the base. So as we transition now to the sort of final engagement and these typical sort of battles between 1 or 2 enemies and friendlies, it's important to remember what direction the enemy was going when they were last spotted. Now, it's possible that you simply didn't see it because they were out of render range, or you just missed the chance you were looking at something else. But you can see that Dave is aiming to the south, and this is because when Dave last spotted the M6, they killed the Fury, turned back around and started heading back down to the south. So Dave is anticipating correctly that the M6 is going to come from the south. Now if you're an attacker, you can double bluff essentially and go south, get unspotted, and then go north, but that's a more advanced technique. But if you're a defender, just look at what Dave is doing here, correctly anticipating to a T where the M6 comes through and gets an easy shot for the Radley Walters medal and the victory. And there we have it, a spectacular performance there from Dave in the T150. They really showed how to deal with the early game, how to position yourself, how to apply pressure to sort of inferior enemies and force the win essentially in each engagement. So getting rid of that RNG aspect, and more importantly, getting rid of time for the rest of the enemy team to react, because you're up against 15 enemies. You don't know, unless you have, mods, whether somebody is more good at the game, more aware of their surroundings and minimaps. And if the T1 Heavy had time to call for help, then help potentially could arrive in the form of more dangerous tanks. So Dave did an effective job there of securing the victory in that engagement and picking up some extra kills, and really showed how to attack and defend the place properly in the encounter battle. And that brings us neatly to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a like. If you thought you spotted something that Dave did really well that I didn't pick up on that deserves a bit of merit, then please consider putting it in the comments below. I'm always eager to sort of learn new ways of improving my performance in the game, because this channel is partly about trying to get me to learn the game better, I suppose. And if you enjoyed the content, consider subscribing. I'm going to try and make more videos like this. They might not be as common because I don't want to push videos out over and over again that I'm not happy with. And I think this format is a good start, but I think it could do with some refinement. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Have a good one.